Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the summer of 378 AD, near the rolling plains of Thrace, in what is now modern-day Bulgaria, a Roman army marched to confront a Gothic horde. Beneath the punishing sun, two worlds collided, one desperately clinging to the old order, the other heralding the chaos of a new age. This Roman defeat shattered the cultural and military foundation of the ancient world. On this day, the might of the Roman Empire crumbled before an enemy it underestimated, unleashing chaos that would reshape Europe for centuries. The empire's borders, once symbols of unyielding strength, buckled. The dominance of Roman legions ended, and a new era of warfare began, one ruled by the thunder of cavalry. For the men on that battlefield, it was a living hell. Infantry crushed under hooves, choked by dust, and pinned so tightly they could not even raise their swords. Thousands were slaughtered, including the emperor himself, their blood seeding the end of an empire. What followed changed the world. The collapse of Rome's western half, the rise of medieval kingdoms, and the transformation of war itself. This battle forged the path to the world that we know today. Let's now experience the Battle of Adrianople.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 88, The Battle of Adrianople, the 9th of August, 378 current era. Gothic forces, 50,000 infantry and 50,000 cavalry. Byzantine Romanic forces, 40,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 was the combat event that shattered the illusion of Rome's invincibility and declared the Goths as more than a wandering horde. Adrianople was their grim debut as architects of a new power dynamic in Western European history, where the balance of civilization itself seemed to tremble. On that blood-soaked field, the disciplined ranks of Roman infantry, long the cornerstone of imperial might, were swept aside by the devastating ferocity and mobility of Gothic cavalry. The echoes of that day did more than announce the Gothic ascendance. They signaled a profound shift in the art of war. The dominance of the well-armored foot soldier, which had defined centuries of Roman military supremacy, crumbled beneath the relentless momentum of mounted warriors. From this moment onward, cavalry would carve its legend into the fabric of European warfare, reshaping strategies and redefining power for the next 1,000 years.
In 337, Constantine the Great, the man who had unified the empire under a single Christian banner, died. And with him died the hope of a stable succession. His dream was naive that his 3 sons, blood-bound brothers, would divide the empire peacefully among themselves. Western Europe, Southeastern Europe, and the East. Each was to be theirs, yet ambition and greed swiftly drowned any sense of familial loyalty. The empire would soon drown in fraternal blood. The tangled mess of betrayals, battles, and assassinations that unfolded after Constantine's death reads more like a grim ledger of treachery than a coherent narrative. His 3 sons, none of whom who lived to die in peace, turned on one another until the last of them fell. In the end, no dynasty survived. The generals, hard men forged in war, seized the power, their ambitions eclipsing any lingering loyalty to Constantine's bloodline. By 364, the chaos yielded a victor, Valentinian I, born of common stock but tempered by a soldier's discipline. Valentinian clawed his way to the summit through sheer ability. As emperor, he turned his gaze toward the Danube, that vital artery of the northern frontier, and sought to secure it against barbarian incursions. To safeguard the east, he made a calculated move, appointing his brother Valens as co-emperor and stationing him in Constantinople. Together, they hoped to split the weight of the empire's burdens. Together, they hoped to endure. But fate is a cruel ally. In 375, Valentinian collapsed and died, leaving the throne to his son Gratian, a mere boy of 16, untested and unready. Power shifted uneasily to Valens in the east, for young Gratian had neither the years nor the authority to check his uncle's growing influence. Valens was a man tragically unfit for the empire's demands. The east boiled with unrest as the Persian king Shapur II clashed endlessly with Byzantine forces. Obsessed with holding the eastern frontier, Valens allowed his northern territories to decay. When war erupted with the Goths, it found him distracted, unprepared, and disastrously overconfident. The Goths were a restless, indomitable people. They began in the icy expanse of Scandinavia, moving south into the forests and plains of northeastern Europe. For generations, they made their home in the steppes of eastern Russia. By the early 3rd century, their migration brought them to the Balkans, where they first crossed swords with the Roman Empire. These were not aimless wanderers. The Goths carved their path through conquest and flame, raiding and plundering as they advanced. Their journey was a saga of bloodshed and survival. By 270, the Goths had plunged deep into Roman territory, cutting a bloody trail through the Balkans and even threatening Greece itself. At last, they were stopped, broken by Roman steel at the Battle of Naissus. Humbled but not yet destroyed, the Goths spent the knee to Rome. An alliance was struck, and for a century, they lived as uneasy allies, quiet but never truly subdued. Over time, the Goths became a vital reservoir of manpower for Rome. As the empire's population withered and its citizens lost their will to fight, Gothic warriors filled the ranks of the legions, their strength a temporary balm for Rome's growing weakness. The Byzantines had subdued the Visigoths, the western branch of the Gothic people, and forged a fragile alliance. Meanwhile, the Ostrogoths, their eastern kin, remained in the Russian steppes. But by the 370s, their world was collapsing. A new threat had appeared on the horizon. The Huns, a storm from the east, their brutal migration forcing the Ostrogoths into retreat. The Ostrogoths fought the Huns, but were shattered, and their power broken. They fled westward, displacing the Visigoths in their path. The Visigoths, under pressure from their own kin, were driven southward into the Danube River Valley, the edge of Rome's northeastern frontier. Desperate and displaced, the Visigoths reached Byzantine lands and begged Valens for sanctuary. The emperor agreed, but with conditions designed to keep them under his thumb. Valens demanded their sons as hostages and ordered the surrender of all Gothic weapons. These terms were calculated to strip them of their strength and secure Rome's upper hand. Yet Valens miscalculated. Unlike the earlier Gothic allies who had been treated with dignity and assimilated into the legions, these Visigoths were met with disdain. Valens squandered a golden opportunity to recruit the warriors into his faltering army. To Valens, these Visigoths were an inferior breed. He had fought them before, and his victories had bred a dangerous arrogance, blinding him to their true potential as both allies and adversaries. In 377, Valens turned his attention eastward, marching against the Persians and leaving the critical task of disarming the Visigoths to 2 disastrous choices: Lupicinus and Maximus, men whose greed far outweighed their competence. Lupicinus and Maximus betrayed their duty, extorting the desperate Visigoths for bribes. Gold lined their pockets, and they indulged in the vilest abuses, demanding the dignity of the warriors' wives and daughters in exchange for leniency. When the Ostrogoths, also fleeing the Huns, sought refuge, they were turned away. Yet, desperation knows no geographical boundaries. They crossed the Danube without permission, shielded by the Visigoths, who were already locked in an uneasy standoff with the Byzantines. The breaking point came swiftly. Overwhelmed by relentless demands for bribes, the Visigothic leader Fritigern united his people with the Ostrogoths, forging an alliance of vengeance against Byzantine corruption. Lupicinus and Maximus, seeking to crush the brewing rebellion, attempted to assassinate Fritigern. Their blade missed its mark, striking down his co-commander Alavius instead. The cost of their failure was war, as the outraged Goths rose in fury. Enraged by the murder of his ally, Fritigern wasted no time. He marshaled his warriors and struck down a Byzantine force at Marianopolis, their blood staining the soil of eastern Bulgaria. Victorious, he joined the Ostrogothic chieftains Alatheus and Syphax in the shadowed plains between the Danube and the Black Sea. The rebellion had grown into a movement, and Valens could no longer ignore it. Valens, now desperate to confront the Gothic uprising, hastily patched up a truce with the Persians. He dispatched his generals, Saturninus, Trajan, and Profuturus, to drive the Goths northward. They forced Fritigern's forces into the treacherous marshes near the Danube's mouth, where the bogs and reeds turned the campaign into a grinding stalemate. The clash in the marshlands ended in bitter inconclusion. Fritigern, masterful in retreat, guided his forces through the mire, escaping the Byzantine trap with his army intact and his resolve unbroken. At every turn, the Goths relied on their trusted defensive formation, encircling their wagons into an impenetrable bastion. From this fortress of wood and steel, they lashed out in calculated strikes, testing the strength of their attackers before pulling back to safety. This tactic was far ahead of its time. Nearly 1,000 years later, it would echo across Bohemia under the command of Jan Žižka and reappear on the battlefields of South Africa with the Boers. Freed from Byzantine pursuit and bolstered by fierce nomadic horsemen from the east, the Goths descended upon the countryside north of Greece. Villages burned, granaries were emptied, and terror spread like wildfire. Valens, now fully aware of the threat, marched his army to Thrace, where the Black Sea shimmered ominously to the northeast. As the crisis deepened, he called upon his nephew Gratian in Italy, begging for reinforcements to stem the Gothic tide. He had no choice. By 378, the Goths were not only regrouping, but forging dangerous alliances with Germanic tribes. These new pacts ignited rebellion along the empire's northern borders, throwing Rome's defenses into chaos. Gratian faced his own storm. German uprisings along the Rhine forced him to march into Gaul, where he crushed the Alemanni and Franks. Only then could he turn his forces southward, advancing down the Danube to aid his uncle. Meanwhile, Valens' generals fought doggedly in Thrace. By the summer of 378, they had pushed the Goths back, regaining precious ground and kindling hope that the rebellion might yet be crushed. The Goths fell back, retreating to the city of Adrianople on the banks of the Maritsa River, nestled in the peninsula between the Adriatic, the Black Sea, and the Dardanelles. Adrianople became the stage for the final act of this brutal campaign. Fritigern's Visigoths entrenched themselves in a fortified wagon camp outside Adrianople. The Ostrogoths, joined by fierce eastern cavalry, including Alans and Sarmatians, scoured the surrounding land for supplies. This horde, numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors and 200,000 dependents, prepared for a showdown. Frustrated with his earlier failures, Valens dismissed his generals and entrusted his hopes to an Italian commander, Sebastiani. Unlike his predecessors, Sebastiani preferred a leaner, more disciplined force, convinced that the bloated ranks of the Byzantine army were brittle and poorly led. With precision and relentless drills, he forged his smaller contingent into a weapon designed to cut deeply into Gothic lines. Sebastiani's approach showed promise. Guerrilla raids struck at Gothic foragers and supply lines, chipping away at their resources. Satisfied with his successes, Sebastiani urged Valens to continue this method, avoiding a direct clash until the enemy was starved into submission. Now confident in his strategy, Sebastiani predicted the Goths would soon crumble. Their vast numbers couldn't survive without steady supplies. Starvation and desperation would drive them eastward, back into the path of the relentless Huns, a solution that required no further bloodshed from the empire. But Valens, consumed by envy, dismissed Sebastiani's counsel. News of Gratian's triumphs in Gaul gnawed at him. Every victory his nephew claimed made Valens appear weak and ineffective. a perception he could not tolerate. Determined now to reclaim his reputation, Valens sought a swift, decisive victory. He refused to wait for Gratian's reinforcements, unwilling to share the glory of defeating the Goths. The decision would prove catastrophic. Arrogance further clouded his judgment. Valens clung to the belief that the Ostrogoths were inferior soldiers, an assumption that blinded him to the peril ahead. As Valens' legions advanced toward Adrianople, Fritigern played for time. He sent envoys under the guise of peace negotiations, stalling while his cavalry, scattered across the countryside on foraging missions, regrouped for the coming battle. Impatient and unmoved by Fritigern's overtures, Valens refused to negotiate. On August the 9th, 378, under the searing summer sun, he led his 40,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry out of Adrianople. By midday, his army stood before the Gothic wagon camp, its defenses bristling with warriors ready for war. Fritigern's gambit continued. Once more he sent envoys to parley, stalling as the last of his forces prepared for battle. Meanwhile, his men torched the surrounding fields, denying the Byzantines the food and the cover they might need. Valens pretended to entertain Fritigern's envoys, but his intentions mirrored those of his enemy. He needed the delay to rest his weary troops and organize them for the coming assault. The blistering heat of the day bore down mercilessly on Valens' army. Exhausted from their march and facing a fortified Gothic laager in defensive position, the Emperor seized the opportunity to let his men rest and study their foe. Chaos erupted as Valens' emissaries approached the Gothic lines. For reasons still unclear, their Iberian escorts loosed arrows into the camp before fleeing in disorder. What followed was now inevitable. The Visigoths, already on edge, erupted in fury. At that moment, the earth itself seemed to tremble as the Ostrogothic cavalry, 50,000 strong, returned to the battlefield, their timing perfect, and their presence devastating. Led by fierce Alan riders, the Gothic cavalry surged forward, descending on the Byzantine lines. Valens' troops, caught mid-deployment, were unprepared for the ferocity of the assault. On the right flank, the Byzantine cavalry clashed with the Gothic horsemen. They fought with grit and resolve, holding their ground against the initial assault, their weapons rising and falling in desperate arcs. Meanwhile, Byzantine cavalry on the left surged forward, attempting to outmaneuver the Gothic lines. Yet, without the support of infantry, their attack lacked the weight needed to break through. Exposed and outnumbered, they became easy prey for the Gothic riders. The fate of the battle was sealed on the right. As the Byzantine cavalry buckled under the relentless Gothic assault, the Ostrogoths unleashed their fury. They smashed into the collapsing flank, shattering its cohesion and driving the chaos deep into the heart of the infantry lines. The Byzantine infantry, still scrambling to form their ranks, was struck with catastrophic force. Encircled by Gothic cavalry, they were blinded by a choking storm of dust, their shields and their swords rendered useless in the confusion. The noose tightened mercilessly. Ammianus Marcellinus, who chronicled the horror, described the grim reality. The infantry forces could not even draw their swords or wield them if they could draw them. The Gothic cavalry, relentless and methodical, unleashed volley after volley of arrows into the suffocating ranks of Roman infantry. The screams of the wounded and dying filled the air as the legionaries fell where they stood. Then, as if the day had not already sealed Rome's doom, Fritigern made his final move. He opened the gates of his wagon camp, unleashing his infantry into the fray. Their advance brought a fresh wave of slaughter. The Gothic warriors, armed with brutal slashing swords and heavy battle axes, cut through the beleaguered Romans like executioners. Thousands of infantrymen fell, their lines collapsing under the weight of the onslaught. Only when the bodies of their comrades lay thick upon the ground did the surviving Romans find the space to maneuver. With desperate effort, a handful broke free of the Gothic encirclement. Valens, stationed with the reserves at the rear, could only watch as the center of his army disintegrated. When the Gothic warriors finally reached his position, the emperor himself took up arms, fighting side by side with his remaining men. Yet even here, the weight of Gothic numbers proved overwhelming. The reserves broke under the pressure, and Valens, wounded and surrounded, fell in the chaos. According to most accounts, Valens was dragged from the battlefield to a peasant's hut. That night, the Goths, unaware of their prize, surrounded the hut and set it ablaze. The Emperor of Rome perished in the flames, his empire burning with him. Valens was only the most prominent victim of the carnage. Nearly all of his top commanders fell that day, alongside an estimated 40,000 soldiers, a devastating blow to the Eastern Roman army. The cost to the Goths remains unrecorded, though by all accounts their casualties were light. It was a staggering, lopsided victory. In the grim ledger of Roman failures, Valens stands as the architect of his empire's humiliation. He ignored sound military counsel from Sebastiani, choosing instead to bow to public pressure, a decision rooted in vanity and fear rather than strategy. Valens allowed the clamor of the masses to dictate his actions, leading him to personally march against the Goths. By doing so, he abandoned Sebastiani's proven strategy of attrition, a method that could have starved the enemy into submission without a pitched battle. The historian Edward Gibbon captures the tragedy with ruthless precision in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Quote, "The citizens, who are always brave at a distance from any real danger, declared with confidence that if they were supplied with arms, they alone would undertake to deliver the province from the ravages of an insulting foe. The vain reproaches of the ignorant multitude hastened the downfall of the Roman Empire. They provoked the desperate rashness of Valens, who did not find, either in his reputation or in his mind, any motives to support with firmness the public contempt. He was soon persuaded by the successful achievements of his lieutenants to despise the power of the Goths." End quote. At Adrianople, Valens succumbed to the worst of human frailties, envy. Ignoring Sebastiani's advice, he allowed his jealousy of Gratian's growing reputation to cloud his judgment. Obsessed with proving his worth to both himself and his empire, Valens refused to wait for Gratian's reinforcements. He marched into battle against overwhelming odds, 100,000 Gothic warriors against his 60, a gamble that would cost him everything. The defeat at Adrianople stands among the darkest chapters in Roman history. Not since Hannibal annihilated a Roman army at Cannae in the Second Punic War had the empire faced such catastrophic loss. The terror that gripped Rome after Adrianople was reminiscent of the humiliation in the Teutoburg forests, where Arminius and his German tribes destroyed 2 Roman legions in AD 9. Adrianople revived those ancient fears of barbarian ascendancy. To the citizens of the empire, Adrianople was a chilling omen. The barbarians who, for centuries, had gnawed at Rome's edges now appeared poised to devour it whole. Had the Gothic forces been more disciplined, better organized, and equipped with siege engines, they might have conquered the Eastern Roman Empire outright. Yet their battlefield prowess could not breach the walls of Roman cities. Constantinople, the great jewel of the East, remained untouched, its defenses unyielding. But the Goths turned their fury on the rest of southeastern Europe, ravaging the land unchecked. In the wake of Valens' death, Theodosius rose to the throne. With grim resolve, he set about rebuilding the shattered military, determined to restore Rome's strength. Within 5 years, Theodosius, with Gratian's support, turned the tide. He drove the Goths from Roman soil, reclaiming the Black Sea's western coast and pushing them back across the Danube. Yet in a pragmatic stroke, he allowed those who pledged loyalty to remain in the lands they had once plundered. Over the next decade, Theodosius refined his strategy. Those Goths who resisted were crushed. Those who surrendered were welcomed, either as settlers within the empire or as soldiers within its ranks. This policy brought seismic changes to the Eastern Roman army, transforming its very nature. For a millennium, the empire's survival had rested on the disciplined shoulders of its legionaries, heavy infantry trained to perfection, their lines unshaken by any foe. But Adrianople shattered that tradition. As Goths filled the ranks, the Eastern Roman army evolved into a force dominated by cavalry, a shift that would alter the face of warfare for centuries to come. These cavalry units, many drawn from the east, excelled as mounted archers. Their devastating range and mobility rendered traditional infantry formations increasingly obsolete. The age of the legionnaire was over. For the next 1,000 years, the mounted warrior ruled the battlefields of Europe. Only in the 15th century, with the rise of missile weapons like the longbow and crossbow, would the supremacy of cavalry finally be challenged. Theodosius, for all his efforts, managed to keep a tenuous peace with the Goths, yet peace tied to the strength of a single ruler is fragile. And when Theodosius died in 395, the empire was left vulnerable. Into this void stepped Alaric, a Gothic leader of vision and ambition. Alaric rallied his people and began a sweeping campaign through southeastern Europe, a march that would ultimately bring him to the heart of the Roman world, Italy. By 410, after relentless pressure and 3 grueling sieges, Alaric achieved what once seemed unthinkable. He captured Rome and unleashed his warriors upon it in a brutal sack. By then, Rome's political significance had waned. Ravenna, with its strategic location and defensible marshes, had become the empire's administrative center. Yet the symbolic weight of Rome's fall was immeasurable. Rome had stood unbroken by enemy hands since the 7th century BC. Its fall in 410 was a seismic blow to the empire's prestige, shaking the foundations of its identity. In the aftermath, the Ostrogoths established themselves in Italy, while the Visigoths swept westward, carving a path through Gaul before settling in Spain. With these shifts, the Western Roman Empire fractured beyond repair. What remained was a patchwork of territories steeped in Gothic culture, bound by shared traditions but devoid of true political unity. Yet the conquerors were not immune to Rome's enduring influence. Even as Gothic rule spread, its people absorbed Roman culture, Roman language, and Roman law, blending the old world with the new. The Battle of Adrianople marked the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. It shattered its military foundations and heralded a new era in warfare, where the mounted warrior reigned supreme across Europe's battlefields.